Let's pray. Jesus, as we open your word, we would like today to hear from you. We'd like to understand things in your word that are meaningful to our hearts and to our walk with you. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. 2 weeks ago, we looked at Isaiah chapter 2. And I painted out a little scenario for you that I would like to redo today and add a little bit to it. This passage starts out with a picture of the future the way God envisions it. Starting in verse 1, the word of Isaiah the son of Amoz saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Now it shall come to pass in the latter days. The word latter, the Lord knows the end from the beginning. In the end days, in the future. This is the end that God has in mind for this world. That the mountain of the Lord's house will be established as the head, literally, of the mountains and exalted above the hills, and all nations will flow into it. This has God picturing a future when the mountain, the high place of God's temple, will be the worship point for all the earth. Now that's not the case, never has been the case. All of the pagan shrines, they'd put them on the tops of hills. They built their towns on the tops of hills. They're sacred places, they're safe places. It's a lot easier to defend yourself when the enemy is coming uphill at you than when they're coming downhill at you. So they always built their towns and temples on the tops of hills, and they'd plant these spreading trees with great shade, and they'd set up their idols, and they'd create their shrines and their pagan rituals on the tops of hills, called the high places. So it says, I'm looking forward, God says, to a time in the future when the high place of Yahweh, the God of Israel, that's the sacred name of the God of Israel, the God of creation, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who presents himself in Scripture, the Tetragrammaton, YHWH. We're not quite sure exactly what vowels ought to go in there, but we say Yahweh. You see, the word Elohim for God could refer to a pagan god, a pagan idol. It could refer to a magistrate, like we talk about Lord so-and-so. Say in the British system, leaders and gods, rulers were Elohim. Israel's God is Yahweh Elohim. That's his name. And Yahweh says there's coming a time when the mountain of Yahweh's house will be established as the head of all the mountains, exalted above all the other hills. So when all the other gods and high places are abandoned and all nations are flowing up into worship God. Now that's not exactly the way things are today. Never have been. Back then they took, carved wood and painted it over with gold and things and set up idols. We're not so archaic anymore. We have other gods that are the works of our hands. The stuff we think is going to give us life is our God. If you have such a big mortgage for that big house and that nice car or two in the garage that you don't have time for God because you're having to work all the time, you know what shrine you're bowing at. You're bowing at the shrine of your stuff. People think if I only get this or get that, or go here or live this way or do that thing, if I possess this or that, I will find life. Those things are your gods. Those are your high places. This looks forward to a time when all nations will have given up all their other gods and dynamics of living and will flow up into the house of Yahweh. Many people will come and say, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the mountain of Yahweh, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways. We will walk in his paths. Out of Zion will go forth the law of the Torah and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. That's not exactly what's happening today. People aren't lining up to say, wow, let's go to church. Let's go worship the God of Israel. Nowadays, the viewpoint is that the God of the Bible is an archaic, patriarchal, anti-feminist, anti-freedom. People who follow the God of the Bible are seen as harking back to something. We're way past that. And nowadays, if you dare to take the laws that God says are the laws of life and suggest that they're the right way to live, you're discriminating, you're putting down somebody else who has an alternate view of how life ought to be lived. We are at a time when the world is not in any way, Western civilization is not in any way saying, let's go to the house of Yahweh. They are heading the other direction just as fast as they can go. I mean, I send out a brochure to try to tell people we're going to talk about the things of God down here at the church, and we can barely get a handful of people out. This predicts a time when the nations will be flowing in. We're going to have to meet outdoors. There won't be room indoors. And they will come up to the house of Yahweh, and he will judge between the nations and rebuke, the better term would be reason or decide for many people. Can you imagine that, a time when the nations of the world are coming to God and saying, how do we solve this dispute? Instead of taking up arms, instead of even diplomacy and all the human-made ways of trying to get along that don't work, right? We always end up in a war. Coming to God. And God is showing them the way, and they're actually following it. How many times have people said, oh, Lord, would you show us the way to go? And so God does, and then they say, no way, we don't want to do it that way. That'll never work. And they go off and do it their own way, and we end up in battle again. And it says when the nations come and let God solve their issues, they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. We won't need implements of war because we won't be going to war. God is the only way this world is ever going to come to peace. When his ways are instituted in our lives and in the lives of others, we will be able to live at peace. Until then, we'll have our swords and spears. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. You know, there are certain people that say if we didn't prepare for war, there couldn't be war. I don't buy that viewpoint. If we just abandon our army, that doesn't mean nobody would attack. Why, they're so nice they got rid of their army. We'd never try to take what is theirs. The world has always preyed upon the weak. If you don't have a strong man to protect, you're dead. This envisions a time when truly all are at peace. Now, as I suggested 2 weeks ago when we talked about this, this is not quite the picture we get in the New Testament. The New Testament book of Revelation and Jesus in Matthew 24 and 2 Thessalonians chapters 1 and 2 and so on shows a deteriorating situation until it's so bad that God's remnant people, his final ones hanging on, are hanging on by their fingernails while the rest of the world is literally allied with and following Satan and out to kill them. And if Jesus didn't swoop in on a great rescue mission, Revelation 19, and rescue his people, and that glory wipes out the opposition, nobody would survive. But this has a different picture to it. This has a picture where somehow, well, this is what I believe God intended. God called Abraham through his descendants to develop a nation that would live life God's way. That's what Israel was supposed to be. So that on planet Earth, right in the middle of things, the crossroads of the nations there in Palestine, where every civilization had to go through to reach any other, commerce all went through there, that they would be living God's life right there for all to see and experience. And Deuteronomy says if they would follow God's laws, it wouldn't bring them into bondage to some onerous law that wrecks their lives. It would actually so enhance their lives that the other nations that are fighting it out there would finally say, wow, These people are protected by their God. We can't touch them. Their families are together. Ours are falling apart. Their religion is joy. Ours is fear. Their economy is share and share alike, and everybody's prospering. We have a few wealthy and everybody else is in poverty. Wow, they have such an amazing society. Let's go find out what their God is all about, because we need what they've got. And the picture, I believe, through the Old Testament is God's ideal that his people would succeed at living his life before the world, and he would protect them from any attackers, and one by one the nations would be won over to the ways of God. There would be some holdouts and there would be some battles. I think those are in Zechariah and Ezekiel and other places. But you have a winning of the nations until the world is following God. That's his goal. God's goal isn't to come in and wipe out. His goal is to save. And so you have this picture of what I've called Plan A. God demonstrates what it's like to live life his way through Israel, and the people begin to flock in, realize the folly of their ways. Messiah would still need to come because sin is still killing us. You still have to have Messiah come, bear the sins. Sin is death, right? Die. We talked about that. And secondly, Messiah will come and he will take on Satan. Remember, the seed of the woman will take on the serpent and crush his head. But in the process, he'd be wounded in the heel. And the picture we talked about last time is that God not only comes to bear the sin and die as a sacrifice, but he also puts himself in a vulnerable position where Satan can squeeze him for all he's worth. Because in heaven, Satan claimed that God was power and control with a PR scheme called love. But if you squeeze God hard enough, he'll come out power and control. And so they started a war, and what did God do? He threw Satan out of heaven. That sounds like power and control. Adam and Eve invited him in here. Now Messiah is going to come and allow himself to come under the squeeze of Satan. And the question is Satan right or wrong? If he squeezes God and wrings him out, will anything but love come out? You've discovered that you don't have to get wrung out very hard before something other than love comes out, right? I know that for sure for me. But is God love to the very core? And there we see it played out with Jesus. Satan squeezed him to the core, and nothing but love came out. Messiah's coming to earth deals with two things: the sins of the world, which crush out his life. Remember, 2 Corinthians 5 verse 21, God made him to be no sin, who knew no sin, to be sin for us. He bore our sins in his body on the tree. 1 Peter 2:24. Messiah becomes sin, and that sin crushes out his life, but in the process he becomes vulnerable to Satan, and Satan is unmasked as cruel and evil to the core, while God is proven to be love to the core, because that's all that can be wrung out of him. Messiah does those two things. But the picture that God has in mind is that Israel will become his nation, that Messiah will come, Satan and the world will attack Messiah, Messiah will bear the sins of the people, but Israel would be on Messiah's side, not the murderer of Messiah. And that's where these prophecies through the Old Testament come in. You realize most of the prophecies of the Old Testament is God painting what can be. Now, if you're raising your kids and telling them they're idiots every day, what are they going to become? If you keep telling them they're going to fail, they're going to fail. And we do not find the Old Testament saying, Israel, I know you're my people, but you're going to fail and murder the Messiah. It doesn't say that. It says, Israel, if you keep going away from me, you're going to get taken over by the nations around you, but I'll bring you back and we'll try again. And if you'll follow me, this is what can be. Nations will come in, and the mountain of the Lord will become the highest mountain, not because you conquer the other nations, but because truth and love conquers the other nations. And really the only place that gives the plan B scenario that Messiah would be rejected by his people is Daniel's prophecies that were sealed until the time of the end. Why were they sealed? Because if they were understood before the cross, they would become a prediction of failure, a predestination that they're going to fail. God never predicted or planned for Israel to murder their Messiah. He knew the world would turn on him while he bore the sins of all. Now, the question that I want to address today is Isaiah 53. Doesn't Isaiah 53 talk about the suffering Messiah? Let's turn there. It's a great, great chapter. Just go through it line by line today. Isaiah 53. You're going to think, man, this series is going to go by fast. We just went all the way from 2 to 53. Well, don't get your hopes up. Who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed, or the strength of the Lord? That flows from the previous 3 verses where it kind of says that when this servant of God, this Messiah comes, things are going to happen that are just dumbfounding, amazing, put you to silence. You don't know how to answer it. Verse 2, for he shall grow up before him, he the Messiah, the servant, shall grow up before him, Yahweh, as a tender plant and as a root out of dry ground. I'm trying to remember where I was not long ago, but there was a stretch of asphalt pavement that was no longer being driven on. And the most amazing thing was there were plants coming up through that everywhere. Abandoned. And now, how does stuff grow? I mean, if my garden plot was asphalt and I sowed my seeds out there, nothing would grow. Now here it says he grows up like a plant rooted in dry ground. You take this pancake hard desert with nothing growing, and all of a sudden there's a little plant growing up. Isolation, but also amazing. How is something like that growing here? How could anything good come out of Nazareth? You see, seeming that something is growing that couldn't possibly be growing there. The coming of Messiah involves him showing up in a way that has everybody amazed. He has no form or comeliness, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we would desire him. Messiah is going to come totally ordinary. You're not going to look at him and say, oh, there he comes, Messiah with a banner. Join me and we'll become rich and famous. Well, we'd all join, but for the wrong reasons. If the king wants to find a queen, he will never know if she loves him or loves being a queen unless he disguises himself as a pauper and wins her love as a commoner. And she marries him not having any idea he's the king. Then he can say, oh, by the way, I'm the king and you're now the queen, because she loves him, not just jewels and wealth and power. I remember, it was several years ago now, I read something about Rod Stewart, the British rocker. He'd had another divorce that cost him a lot of money, and I guess he's had quite a few of those. And he said the next time he decides to marry someone, he'll just buy her a house instead. You know, the only way somebody like that, who's famous, who's glamorous, who catches the eye of people, will ever know if anybody actually loves him is if he completely disguises himself and somebody falls in love with him. Right? That's Messiah. He's going to come in a way that is totally ordinary. There will be no reason to look and say, oh, I want to follow him. He's like a little plant growing up in the middle of an asphalt jungle. What's that doing there? That's awfully ordinary. How's it growing? But nothing to say, oh, I want that. Totally, totally ordinary. Verse 3, he's despised and rejected by men. The word men there is not the word Adam, as it often is. It's the word Ish. Ish and Isha, male and female. So it doesn't mean he's despised and rejected by mankind, but by men, some people. A man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. We hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. This tells us that Messiah is not going to be readily accepted by people. Remember, he doesn't appear to have anything to offer. And you know, when something is ordinary, it's proper to say, by ignoring it, you're acting as if you despise it. You have no value in it, no esteem in it. That fits that total ordinariness again. But it also suggests that Messiah would have people generally not only ignoring him, but actually acting hostile. There's going to be a lot of hostility, not seeing any value in him, hiding our faces, turning away. Oh, that's of no value. I have more important things to do. Verse 4, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. That could be translated, he's borne our pains and carried our sicknesses. When Messiah comes, he doesn't come in a God body. He doesn't come in an Adam body before the fall. He comes with all the physical weaknesses subject to tooth decay and getting the flu and stubbing your toe. The normal stuff of life, the emotional traumas, the griefs, the losses. He doesn't walk around in some cocoon that keeps him in comfort and safety from all of this, claiming to know our plight. He actually comes as one of us and bears our sins and our griefs. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. God striking him? Does God afflict his own Messiah? God is Messiah in human flesh. He takes on the affliction of the human race when he comes in human flesh. So Messiah will be one of us. He was wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we were healed. Or we are healed, verse 5. Now this adds another dimension. Not only does he seem out of place, totally ordinary, something we don't really value and feel any need to draw near to. In fact, we turn away and give it no esteem, even unto despising it as valueless. He comes actually living our condition, our human condition in our fallen state. But then beyond that, he takes on himself our sins and transgressions. God made him who knew no sin, he was sinless, to be sin for us. Notice it says he made him to be sin. Like he makes rocks, and he makes trees, and he makes worlds, and he makes universes. He made Jesus, he made Messiah to be sin. I'm trying not to use the word Jesus here. I'm trying to look at this without that context right now. This is talking about Messiah. We read it through Jesus, yes. But Messiah would take on the sins. 1 Peter 2:24 says he bore our sins in his body. This is not a spiritual metaphor. This is a physical reality. Messiah would physically become our sins, which means God takes them from us, past, present, and foreknowledge, future, and he removes, I don't know how he removes the sin from me. That's a miracle too, right? But as if it's something in my pocket, you know. What have I got in here? A USB drive, okay? This is sin, you know. I got it in my pocket. He takes it out, and he puts it in Jesus' pocket, and it's not even mine anymore. It now belongs to him. God takes it away from me, and it becomes his. He takes what is me and makes him the bad part of me. And when Messiah dies, he actually dies the death of my sin. That's what Messiah is going to do. Wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. And then notice, the chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. Because he bears my sin, I can be made whole and holy in him and become the full human being that he made me to be in the first place. That sin has torn away. Jesus takes the sin, or Messiah takes the sin, so that I can become whole. This isn't just about getting saved, escaping hell and death. This is about being fully restored into the glorious image of God creatures we were made to be in the first place, but the sin has stolen from us. So we're talking about getting out of death and getting fully into life. That's what Messiah is all about. And that will bring peace in our souls and in our communities. We all, like sheep, have gone astray and have turned everyone to his own way. How many of us need him to bear our sins, Messiah to bear our sins? Everyone. So the Lord Yahweh has laid on him, Messiah, the servant, the iniquities of us all. You do recognize Jesus bore all sin, not just the sins of those he decided to save, not just the sins of those he knew would choose him. He bears the sins, he bore the sin of all. Messiah would bear the sin of every human being, so nobody needs to miss out on life. But he gives us the choice of whether we want it or not. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, as a sheep before his shearer is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Jesus so became my sin that when he who was sinless was treated as the vilest of criminals, he never defended himself. He accepted it as his lot because he had become our sin. So he just takes it with humility. He was taken from prison and from judgment. And who will declare his generation? It appears that he came to an end. He was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken. There is the only place in this entire chapter that it mentions God's people. When Messiah came, this chapter does not predict that his people would turn on him. It predicts the world would turn on him. It predicts that he'll bear the sin of his people, but it does not predict that his people would be the one to kill him. That's what I want you to notice here. Plan A is not that Israel is going to forsake God and kill their Messiah. Plan A is that God is going to come as Messiah, bear the sins of his people and the whole world. Yes, the world and Satan will turn on him. It will be ugly. But the picture is not that Israel would join the ugly side. I think the picture is that Israel would be on Messiah's side and maybe get in trouble for it. God's plan never was that his people kill their Messiah, though their Messiah would die for their sins at the wrath of Satan and the world. Yes, he does bear the sins of his people. He's cut off for the transgression of his people. He was stricken. Literally, he took the blow. They made his grave with the wicked but with the rich in his death. Interesting the way that was fulfilled in Jesus. He was crucified as a criminal and ended up in a rich man's borrowed grave. Fulfilled exactly. Because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. That is quoted virtually word for word in 1 Peter 2:22 from the Septuagint of the Old Testament. Jesus, it brings in here, Messiah will be sinless, but he will bear the sins of all. He will taste the wrath of Satan and the world. He will take it as his due because he's bearing that sin. And the only reason people will ever follow Messiah is not because of power and glory, but because they see his character and who he really is. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him and to put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of Yahweh shall prosper in his hand. Notice it says Yahweh was pleased to bruise Messiah. Again, does God like beating up people? How did Yahweh bruise Messiah? By laying on him the sin of us all. That's why it pleased him to do it, because that means we can be with him forever. It pleased God to do whatever he needed to do, to take whatever beating or bruising was necessary at the hands of the serpent. Remember, the serpent would bruise the heel. Genesis 3:15, yet here it says God bruised. It's all the same thing. In taking it on, he takes the beating with pleasure, because the beating means he will see his seed. Oh, it looked earlier like he was cut off from the land of the living, and who knows his generation, verse 8. But now it says he will see his seed, prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. The good news is that by taking the beating and appearing that he'd come to an end, he actually won, and we will be with him forever, and his seed will survive and thrive, and that's you and me. We are the seed. The offspring of the barren is more than the offspring of the fertile. He shall see the travail of his soul and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. What is satisfying to God? The fact that Jesus got beat up, the fact that Messiah is ill-treated, is that satisfying to God? You know, we have the songs that say, you know, on the cross where Jesus died, the wrath of God was satisfied. I don't buy that at all. It didn't satisfy God's wrath. He faced Satan's wrath. The reason God is satisfied is because in facing it, he won us. That's what satisfies God. By his knowledge, my righteous servant, that's the Messiah, shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. That's what's satisfying. You know, you go out and work hard, sweat hard, doing something, growing a garden, or, you know, painting your house or whatever. You're not satisfied in the sweat and the toil, but you're satisfied in the product, right? That's what's satisfying. Going to school to get a diploma is not, I never found that very satisfying at all. But getting out of school with the diploma was very satisfying. I couldn't wait to get out. The satisfaction wasn't in the process, it was in what resulted from it. Therefore, as a result of all this, I will divide him a portion with the great. He'll divide the spoil with the strong. In other words, he who descended will ascend and become Lord of all. Because he poured out his soul unto death, he was numbered with the transgressors. He bore the sin of many, made intercession for the transgression. Sing, O barren, you who have not borne. Break forth into singing and cry aloud, you who have not travailed with child. For more are the children of the desolate than the children of the married woman, says the Lord. Do you see how that flows on? The one whose generation appeared to come to an end, whose life was taken from the land of the living, even though he appears to have lost to be the barren one, his seed will be far greater than the other side in the long run. That seems to have the majority of the world today. Now, the reason I've gone through this with you is I want you to see the picture of Messiah. What we tend to do is we tend to look at that through New Testament eyes. We see Israel being, or the Jewish people being the hand that turned against Messiah, that turned him over to the Romans to death, that were taunting him at the cross. And so I've tended to read this with a whole, dare I say, anti-Semitic mindset. As if this is predicting that's what God's people would do. It's not predicting that at all. This is part of plan A. God's plan was for his people to accept his way of life, become a shining light to the nations. He would come to them as Messiah. They would probably join him in the process of getting beat up by the world. He would bear their sins, he would die, he would rise, and he would reign, and the world would be brought in a nation at a time. And you have a whole different scenario of the conversion of the nations. And that is what God predicted, because that is what God desired. He does not predict your failure, people. He predicts your salvation. He predicts your restoration, not your destruction. He does warn if you go down the path of destruction, you're going to fall over the cliff. And if you remember, John Travers lives in Bend, Oregon. He called me. He said yesterday he went out to there's some rock climbing area not far from his house, and he went out to check out a route that he wanted to climb with a friend. And there was a couple climbing down it without ropes. Not real bright, because it's vertical, steep, and it's the kind you always use a rope on. This guy and girl were climbing down, and he said he was around a corner. He didn't see it, but he heard it. She fell. He said it was sickening. Now, in this case, she fell about 10 feet, slid about another 10 feet, and stopped with her feet dangling over a 50-foot drop. And her boyfriend had to climb down to her and then help her get somewhere, and then got her on a rope and rappelled off, and she lived. She was hurt, but she lived. But you know, if you do that kind of stuff, you're going to get killed. God says if you follow the wrong way, if you don't follow life, you'll end up in death. He's not threatening. He's not predicting. He's not intending that for you. He's telling you what will happen if you do that, but his intent for you is for good and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. So I believe what we have here is we need to read the Old Testament without our New Testament glasses. These are not predicting Jewish national failure. This is predicting success and what's going to happen. I even think most of Jesus' parables are looking at what can happen if the people will actually accept him. And it's not till the last few weeks of his life on earth that he begins to talk Matthew 24 and that kind of stuff that says this thing's going down. It's not till 2 days before his arrest that he says your house is left desolate and walks out. It's not till 2 days before his arrest that he calls the Pharisees every name under the book, whitewashed tombs and everything else. Up till then, he's trying to win them. Finally, at the end, he sees the end is coming. He knew it would be this way, but love never says you're going to fail me. Love encourages you to succeed. Finally, at the close of his life, he begins to give this other scenario. What's going to happen if he's rejected? And then, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, I believe the book of Revelation is a divinely inspired anthology of the Old Testament prophecies that still apply. What part of the Old Testament, which is predicting Plan A, is still going to apply under Plan B, where Messiah was rejected, so he couldn't set up a kingdom here. He has to go back and reign from on high. The disciples spread the gospel. Things are going to get worse and melt down. He's going to come in with a rescue, take his faithful ones out for a much-needed respite of 1,000 years, the honeymoon, a break. You need a break today. And then come back to earth, deal with the final issues of the sin problem, recreate the earth in its Edenic beauty. And then truly all nations will be following him, because it's all the redeemed. That's the Revelation scenario. That's not the Old Testament picture. You're not going to find that very well in the Old Testament. You'll find hints, but those hints are part of Plan A, except for Daniel's sealed prophecies. So what does God do? He sets John out there on the island of Patmos, and he says, now, I'm going to tell you how it's going to wrap up, how it's going to happen. And 240-some Old Testament references are in the book of Revelation. Almost every verse has a quote or an allusion to an Old Testament story or prophecy. And God picks and chooses through the Old Testament, and he outlines Plan B now that Plan A is dead, because Messiah was rejected. And he lays that out for us in the book of Revelation. This is why you're going to find yourself in all kinds of trouble if you try to fit all the Old Testament prophecies into the New Testament scenario. And I have friends who are trying to do it, people that are trying to do it. I see it all the time. And it gets so confusing, as if everything in the Old Testament has to ultimately be fulfilled. No, much of what was in the Old Testament is Plan A, aborted at the cross because his people rejected. That scenario can't happen. So then God rewrites the scenario, borrowing from the Old Testament, and we go to the book of Revelation. I urge you not to try to fit all the Old Testament into the book of Revelation. You're trying to make Plan A fit into Plan B. It can't work. We've got to accept the way God outlines the way it's going to end. We see it rooted in the Old Testament, but plan A failed. His people did not live his life, welcome him as a Messiah, go through his death with him so he could reign as king and call in the nations. He has gone to reign from on high. We are to spread the gospel here of the kingdom of God in hearts. He will come back, rescue us. We'll take a break. Then he'll finish things off, and we will live in his kingdom forever. That's the end time scenario. But the point of today is simply this, and it's a bit academic, I understand that. We need to be careful that we don't read our New Testament perspective into the Old Testament at every stage. Isaiah 53 does not predict the Jews would reject Jesus. It predicts Messiah would be rejected by many in the world, that he would bear the sins of all in the world, and that he would win a seed for eternity. But Israel should have been with him in that sacrifice, not against him. You know, Christianity, dare I say, has had a huge problem with anti-Semitism. You know what I mean by anti-Semitism against the Jewish people? Why did we abandon Sabbath for Sunday? The real root reason is anti-Semitism. Why do we worship on Easter Sunday instead of Passover time? The root is anti-Semitism. Here's what happened. To the Romans, Jews and Christians were two sides of the same coin. Kind of like today. How many of you here know the difference between a Shiite and a Sunni Muslim? Probably a couple who've lived over in that neck of the woods. But unless you've studied it, you really don't know there's a difference. They see themselves as two totally different worlds. What do we see? Two different groups of Muslims with an argument. What did the Romans see? Christians and Jews, same Bible, same day of worship, same God, just an argument over a guy named Jesus, whether he was alive or dead. So when they persecuted and killed Jews, they grabbed Christians. When they grabbed Christians, they grabbed Jews. And so by about 120 or 130 AD, the Jews and the Christians begin throwing barbs at each other, trying to separate and distance each other and say to Rome, we're not them and they're not us. And that's the main motivation between abandoning the Sabbath, moving to Easter Sunday from Passover, and a lot of other stuff that we take as history today, is because to save our own necks, we started officially hating Jews so that the Romans would stop killing us with the Jews. Now, I'm not saying Christians today hate Jews, but it's interesting to realize where some of our shifts came. And what we need to realize is the Old Testament did not predict the failure of the Jewish people. It warned what would happen if they did, but it didn't predict it. That's never God's intent. His intent was their success. And as we read through and study the book of Isaiah, if we can keep this in our minds, don't read it through the rejection of Messiah. Let's try to understand it from the context that God in Isaiah is warning his people that if they stay on the path they're on, they're headed for destruction. And he flips back and forth all through the book of Isaiah between warning them if they stay on the path where they're headed. You know that phrase I used a while back? You're going to end up where you're headed? That's a very deep phrase. If you stay on this trajectory, the end is trouble and death. But then he flips back and says, but here is my vision for you. This drives me nuts in the book of Isaiah because he's going between condemnation and prediction of grand things. And it's like back and forth, back and forth. And at first that doesn't work for me. But as I'm looking at it this way, it's starting to make more sense. God is giving warnings. Stay on the trajectory you're on. You're headed for trouble. And you're almost there. You better turn around now. The bridge is out. And you're on the bridge. But then he turns around and says, but the day is coming when the mountain of the house of the Lord will be the head of all the mountains, and all nations are going to flow in. He tries to inspire his people of what he has for them. He says, I do not wish for you evil, but good, a future and a hope. And as we read the book of Isaiah and study it together, I want you to keep these pictures in mind. Messiah hasn't come and been rejected. It's not God's intent. Rejected by his people. That's not God's intent. And he's laying out here the warnings for the trajectory they're on, and then he keeps wafting eloquent with great poetry about the possibilities that can be. Now, I believe we can look at these same things, and as we study it, realize that we're on the wrong trajectory, and we need to turn around, because the bridge is out, and we're already going onto the bridge. But on the other hand, God still looks at you and me, and he says, man, have I got a future for you. Forgiveness, healing, wholeness, glory. The whole universe is sitting on the edge of their seat, Romans 8, 19 and 20. Anticipating when we are the glorious, restored beings that God made us to be. That's God's prophecy for you. Not death and destruction. That's a warning. His prophecy is always glory. Jesus, we need to see through your eyes. Let us be able to view our world, ourselves, each other through your eyes. So that the warnings don't become predictions, but the glory does. And that we can grasp and embrace the glory you have for us and for each other. And we can become messengers of the good news that we are headed for glory in you. We thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.